If you'd like to follow along with us, we'll be in Mark chapter 15 and 16 this morning. Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 33. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar and put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Imagine if you had been standing there at the foot of the cross at the very moment when Jesus breathed his last, you would have thought that darkness had won. At that moment, there were no answers given. There was no explanation. There was no comfort to be had, only pain and suffering and death. And broken dreams lay scattered on the ground. All there was darkness. Darkness everywhere. Or at least that's the way it seemed. For even in the midst of darkness, there's often light. The light of hope that we sometimes do not see. It's a forgotten hope. The disciples had missed it completely. Even though Jesus had tried to make it very, very clear, on at least 3 occasions, he had told them exactly what was going to happen. He said the Son of Man is going to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, that he would suffer and die. And so it had come to pass. But on each of those 3 occasions, he had also given them a message of hope. A message that none of them had understood. He had said, after 3 days, the Son of Man will rise again. It was a message forgotten because of the gloom of Friday. But even in the midst of such utter despair, there were signs of hope. Signs to be had for those with eyes to see, hidden in the midst of the darkness. Clues that what was taking place before their very eyes was not the end. And so let's look again at the end of the story, at Jesus' death, and see the signs. And it begins with Jesus' cry of despair on the cross, which is actually from a psalm. It's from Psalm 22. A psalm that, curiously enough, speaks of the events that play out on that Friday. It begins with a cry of despair and lament. Psalm 22, verse 1 and 2. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Describes the pain and agony that Jesus suffers in almost prophetic fashion. Look at verses 6 and 8. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by people. All who see me mock me and hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Skip down to verse 16. Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil men have encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. You see, this Psalm of David, penned long ago, aptly describes the fate of Jesus on the cross. Yet in good Jewish fashion, it also speaks of hope. Hope that this suffering is not the end of the story, that God will rescue. So hear these lines from that exact same psalm, the psalm which Jesus himself points to in his dying cry. Verses 22 and 24. How about declare your name to my brothers in the congregation? I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All your descendants of Jacob, honor him, revere him, all you descendants of Israel, for he has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. You see, the message of the psalm is that even in the midst of affliction, God is still at work. He is not forgotten, even when it seems as if he is far from me. And even on that Friday, there were signs of God's presence, but they were missed by the people that were standing there. Signs that the world had changed, that Jesus' death was not in vain. So, for example, it says that the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Now, this most likely was that inner curtain that separated the holy from the Holy of Holies. It was the curtain which blocked people from the very presence of God. Yet now, the message is, through the death of Jesus on the cross, the presence of God was released from its confinement, and it was free now to be among his people. It is a death that reveals the glory of God. And when the centurion sees how Jesus dies, he himself realizes that this is no ordinary man, and he cries out, truly this was God's Son. A confession that countless other Gentiles will now make because Jesus has died for them. All the signs were there that something besides defeat had taken place that Friday, that God had truly acted, that God was not done, but the disciples were not there to see the signs, for they had run away. And they were trapped in their own personal darkness, enshrouded in fear and despair. And that even moved into the next morning, because as Saturday dawned, the disciples woke up and things were no better. You see, the Sabbath was given by God to the Jews as a blessing. It was a weekly day of rest. It was a reminder of God's action on their behalf. It was a break from the mundane and the trivial. It was a time to contemplate the important and the significant. It was a time meant for joy and relaxation, a time to ponder and consider what God has done, a time set aside for renewal and rejuvenation. But this particular Saturday was the worst day of their lives. It was a day of despair and mourning. The disciples were completely disoriented. They didn't know what was coming next. They didn't know what to do next. Everything they had known for the last several years had been stripped away. Their hopes, their dreams, their visions and plans and aspirations lay crushed and broken on the ground in the dust. It seemed like the whole world was coming to an end, and for them, it truly had. The darkness of Friday continued into Saturday with no hope of dissipation. Jesus' body had been taken care of by strangers because the disciples were all hiding. And when Sunday came, no one expected anything to change. No one remembered the message of hope that Jesus himself had uttered each time he had predicted his death. None of the disciples foresaw what was about to happen because the darkness seemed too deep. Even the women who come to the tomb, they don't come with expectation. They don't come in faith. They come in love and out of a sense of duty. They come not to see a spectacle, but to pay their last respects. They come to anoint a dead body. They come to say goodbye one last time, to end the story with as much dignity and respect as they can muster. But what they find, or rather don't find, is the last thing they expected. So let us read chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, this morning we're hearing the Easter story in its briefest form. Mark is the first gospel written, and he presents it with such an abrupt account. In fact, the story actually ends in verse 8. 9 and through 20 were added by a later hand, and if you have a Bible, that it should mark with brackets or some kind of footnote, letting you know that 9 through 20 are not part of the original account. Mark ends in verse 8. Here we find no resurrection appearances. There's no revelation to the 11 disciples. It's a rather simple, almost startling scene. As the women come with their spices ready to anoint the body of Jesus, they're discussing this very practical problem. Who's going to roll away the stone? You see, Jesus has been laid in a rock-cut tomb. It's a cave-like structure, and there's a disc-like stone that has been rolled in a rut in front of it to block the way. And they're trying to figure out, well, who can move that for us? But the dilemma is short-lived, because when they approach the tomb, they see that it's already been rolled away, and they curiously enter, and they find this young man clothed in a white robe. And they're rather startled, but the young man is really not a man. He's an angel. He's a messenger of God. And he has two important messages to impart. First, Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified, is dead no longer. He is risen. He is risen indeed. He's not here. Look for yourselves at the place where they laid him. It's empty. Something astonishing has happened. The power of death has been overcome. The end of the story has been rewritten. They came to the place of death only to find that it has been vacated. But the angel had a second message. He says, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you into Galilee. And there you will see him, just as he told you." Singling out of Peter, I think, is exceedingly purposeful. Jesus has not abandoned the ones who abandoned him. Jesus will not deny those who denied him. Peter is about to be rescued from his own personal hell. And the disciples will be reclaimed in spite of their failure. The resurrection means redemption is still possible. God is not done with them yet. And so they are called to go to a place where they will see Jesus, just as he said. Jesus was rejected, just as he said. Jesus was killed, just as he said. And now he is risen, just as he said. And you will see him. That's where Mark ends. He ends with a promise. No resurrection appearances, no glorified encounters, but this kind of profound expectation of hope. The story seems unfinished. The women's fear and silence leaves us with this question. What happens next? If they're not going to speak this glorious message, well, then who will? And so it ends. Now, what do we do with a story like that? What do we do with that today? What does it mean for our lives? I mean, is this kind of merely a historical curiosity? I mean, all of these events are exceedingly unusual as we look back on them and marvel. But has anything really changed? I mean, the world continues on as it always has, and darkness is still among us. And the older I get, the more I realize that pain and tragedy and heartache are built into the very fabric of our existence. I mean, when you're young, most of the people you know are young, and really the problems of life are not that momentous. You know, like you want to make sure that you're not late for your favorite cartoon, and you want to make sure there's enough Cheerios in the cupboard, and I mean, that's your worries of the day. But the older you get, the more problems you encounter. The longer you live, the more people you know and the more stories you hear, stories of sorrow and hurt. I think it was a week and a half ago. My niece celebrated her birthday, but it also happened to be the 1-year anniversary of her mother's death. I couldn't help reflecting on that. Every year from now on, the day that is meant to be a day of joy is going to be a reminder of that heartache. The longer you live, the more opportunity there is for those you care about to experience something terrible, a sickness like cancer, a sudden debilitating event like a heart attack, to see them go down enslaved to addiction. And then, of course, there's death, especially death. The longer you live, the more people around you die. People you know and people you love begin to age before your very eyes. And the longer your life, the more death you see. Grandparents, and then parents, friends and relatives, and sometimes, worst of all, even children. There's this horrible inevitability about it. Well, we joke about it. We were out this past week celebrating my wife's and daughter's birthday, and my son says, "Well, Mom, a step closer to the grave." You're like, "Well, thank you. Appreciate that very wonderful thought." A joke, yet stunningly true, right? No matter whose story we tell, it always ends the same, without variation. Death is always the final chapter. And between the cradle and the grave, we see hardships and heartache that must be endured. Yet the story before us this morning is a reminder of a forgotten hope. The resurrection of Jesus does not protect us from pain and suffering, just as God did not protect Jesus from having to die on the cross, from having to suffer. Jesus never said that all will become sunshine and light because you now follow him. No, what Jesus has done is show us the light that now exists even in the midst of the darkness. Jesus has given us hope. His resurrection doesn't change the nature of the world. Pain and suffering and death still happen. Babies still die. Children are still abused. Loved ones are still lost. Darkness is still just as real as it was before. But the message of the resurrection is a reminder of something so important that we cannot exist without it. Hope. It's a message we need to hear, not just at a funeral when someone loved one has passed away, but we need to hear it throughout our lives, in those moments of darkness that seek to overwhelm us, when everything seems lost, when we wonder, why should we get up the next morning? The message of the resurrection is, this isn't the end. It's not the final word. Death does not get to close the book or end the story. Death and darkness no longer win. They no longer control our destiny. It's a reminder that new creation is on the way, that something better is ahead, something worth striving for, something worth getting out of bed in the morning for, something worth living for. The story of the resurrection is the story of final victory, but is also about hope for today. Life has its dark moments, but it has light as well. Glorious light. Light that dispels the darkness. The story of the resurrection is about final victory, yes, but it is also a call to look for other victories along the way. It's a call to realize that light is already among us because of what Jesus has done. To see and hear and experience those stories where love triumphs, where mercy is on display, where we see someone who is conquering their addictions, where we see relationships restored, where we see people giving their lives sacrificially for the sake of others, where we see lives reclaimed. There's stories all around us. Life has its ups and downs. It has its triumphs and it has its defeats. It has times of excruciating pain and suffering, but it also has these moments of incredible joy and laughter and excitement. Pure awe. To live in this world and to care is to experience pain. But tragedy is never the end. Suffering is never the final note. Throughout the Scriptures, it is the same message God shouts to us over and over again. There will be darkness, but after the darkness comes light. And we see this message in the very first chapter of the Bible. In the creation story itself, God comes and dispels the darkness. And so each new day begins not with night, but with morning. And there was evening, and there was morning, a new day. And so it is that the resurrection of life, of the cycle of life, is reversed. That instead of life, then death, it's death, then life. A new life, a fresh start, a new beginning, a glorious morning. Because of Christ's death and resurrection, the story always ends the same. It always ends in glory. It always ends in redemption. It always ends in renewal. It always ends in a new creation. The message of Easter morning is that freedom awaits. It's the message of new beginnings and fresh starts, not just at some distant point in the future, a hope way out there far from us, but today, in this very moment. I can't promise that your pain will vanish overnight, but I can promise it won't last forever. That there is light amidst the darkness, and there's hope for better days ahead. I ask the praise team to come forward as we close with this psalm, the end of this psalm once again, the psalm that Jesus uttered from the cross, I think pointing us to a message that we need to remember. You who fear the Lord, praise Him, for He has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden His face from him, but He has listened to his cry for help. May God be praised.